Hey there, it's Silver. This is Dungeons 4. I was pretty excited to get into this one. Actually, I was a really big Dungeon Keeper fan back in the day, especially the first one, although I still really enjoyed the second one a lot too. But Dungeon Keeper is one of those games that sort of created and then killed a genre, basically, because there wasn't really anything else like Dungeon Keeper when it came out, and ever since then there have only been just a couple of things that have tried to sort of recapture that, and none of them have been extremely successful to the point of actually creating like a renaissance of the genre or anything like that. But the closest we've gotten would be this series, the Dungeons games. War for the Overworld was also a really good option, but in terms of an actual series, something that's stuck around, you pretty much only have this. So yeah, the fourth main entry, and this is in fact more of a direct sequel to the third game, involving some of the same characters and things, and also, by the way, having the same narrator, who is the Stanley Parable's narrator, famously. So the narration in this game is fantastic, because it's done by someone who is just one of the greatest of the video game narrators that you can think of. And this is, of course, a dungeon management game, although it also has a pretty complex extra layer to it this time around. So the way that it works is you are in control of a dungeon. You are evil, and it is your job to spread your evilness. There is a campaign mode, which is what I'm going to be showing in the background for the most part. It goes through several missions, including some tutorials and stuff, and tells the story of these characters and what has happened after the events of the third game. But it's also got a skirmish mode with several different skirmish options and a sandbox mode, so there's quite a lot here to play around with. Each map in this game is actually two separate maps, because you have to worry about an underworld where you're actually building your dungeon and an overworld. And generally speaking, every dungeon will have at least one exit to the overworld somewhere. Usually there's more than one, although sometimes they're secret and you have to dig around to find them. The overworld will have some hero bases, as well as some construction crews that'll go around to build even more hero bases and spread themselves around, and they will send expeditions down into your dungeons that you've got to worry about and actually repel. And of course, the main thing you're going to be doing is ordering your minions, your little snots around the place, in order to just do everything. So you'll want them to dig out specific shapes at first, and then you'll want to build certain rooms in those shapes of certain sizes in order to be able to recruit new creatures or give more functions to whatever it is you're doing. And all of the stuff that you can do in the game is all ordered by this big tech tree. So you have four different sort of trees to go down. You have the dungeon tree, which is just you, your little snots, and the things that you can do in a sort of basic sense, like the ability to unlock doors, to upgrade your basic minions, to make sure your dungeon heart regenerates faster, or maybe it can even defend itself when it gets attacked, things like that. And then the other three are actually your main factions, because you have three separate factions of forces, and these determine what kind of creatures you can recruit to your side, as well as what sorts of buildings you can build in your dungeon. So the first one is Horde, and Horde, these are your big, dumb ball of death creatures, right? These are the ones that are most effective in large, overwhelming numbers. They're cheap, they level up faster than everyone else, they're kind of the expendable force. The downside to this relative cheapness and speed of leveling is that when they're dead, they're generally speaking gone for good, so you do have to keep replacing them. And their main gimmick is an arena that they can fight in to level up even faster, as well as you can put a fighting pit in it to just sort of focus creatures on leveling in their idle time, which is pretty handy, honestly. And then you've got demons. Demons are pretty expensive, but they take up less room in your dungeon, because the Horde actually needs an encampment to sleep in. Every time you recruit a Horde creature, it'll build a bed in its specific room, so you've got to have a big enough room to actually fit the beds for all the creatures that you have. Demons do not need this. They don't need any place to sleep or anything, and instead they just regenerate health on their own while they're roaming around. However, they do need something called a nexus, which is like this sort of evil portal thing, and the way that it works is when they die somewhere in the overworld, or I guess in the underworld too, their spirit will be sent to this nexus, and as long as you have enough of this currency, which is called evilness, which I'll get onto in a little bit, you can revive them, so they're not actually lost forever when they die, but if you don't have enough, then they will be lost forever. So this allows you to think of their relatively high recruitment cost as sort of like an investment. They are very powerful and work together very well, even in small numbers, with lots of like fire damage attacks, and there's even a succubus that can turn enemies against each other and some things like that, so they're pretty cool. And also in the demon skill tree, there is an arcanum that allows you to store mana that you can mine and generate. And you can also unlock spell lists in the demon skill tree to actually spend this mana on spells. Although one extra thing that demons will need, once they reach a certain level, they'll require a relaxation bath. They actually need a mana bath that you have to build a specific room for in order to relax. And then finally, you've got the undead. The undead are pretty cool. They need a room like the horde creatures where their beds are built, although in this case it's a graveyard and it's actually their graves being built. But the way they work is if they die, then a hero's corpse is actually dragged back to the graveyard and laid around on the floor, and they can use this to regenerate themselves and actually come back. So as long as you're able to find corpses of heroes, you can keep reviving your undead. They also tend to be quite powerful, especially once upgraded, and you can also build a temple for them to sort of pray in, which is something that they will require eventually, and you can build a sacrificial altar in the middle of this temple that allows them to generate this resource called Blight, and when you have enough of it, they can expend some of it to generate more undead minions. So basically, these minions don't count against your creature limit, so you can have way more creatures than you would normally have, and each type of undead can summon their own specific creature companions. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses and their own things that you need to dedicate space to in your dungeon, so it's very much up to you which ones you want to use and how much. At first, some of your most basic of researches will only cost gold, and you simply get gold by digging out tiles that have gold in them, as well as finding gold and gem veins that you can build treasuries around in order to have your snots mine them and actually give you a consistent income of stored gold. You'll have to first purchase the first level of the entire faction's skill, so like just purchase like the Horde level 1 research, but then after that you'll be able to actually start purchasing the tier 1 upgrades underneath that, and then once you purchase the level 2 Horde upgrade, you'll get access to the tier underneath that, and so on until you get to the bottom of each faction's skill trees. So yeah, the amount of research you've put into each of the faction's main skill, it determines how many creatures that you can have total. Each research increases your creature cap by a little bit, but it also increases the tier of tech that you can research, as well as how many research points you can put into it, because oftentimes the creatures themselves have several upgrades, and you can research that creature multiple times at increasing costs to improve them in various ways. Usually you really want to do this because the improvements are like drastic. But even though the very early sort of tier 1 upgrades may only cost gold, you'll quickly find that everything will start to cost this other resource called evilness as well. Evilness is something that you mostly gain from killing heroes. It's this sort of orange crystal resource, and you actually have to build a vault of evilness in your dungeon to store it. It does need to be physically stored, and the bigger you build your vault, the more of it you can store in each one. So you can basically just think of it as something that you get for doing evil deeds. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of it for slapping one of your minions and making them work faster. Mostly you'll get it from killing heroes, and of course the more powerful heroes will drop more evilness. You'll also get large chunks of it for doing things like raiding the overworld and destroying heroic camps. There are also sometimes powerful, good-aligned creatures like unicorns that you can kill for a whole bunch of it, and oftentimes each map will also have several different objectives that you can meet, and many of them are optional and sometimes time-limited as well. And if you're able to meet them, then they'll give you a big chunk of evilness at once. And this is all really important because you want to store as much of this stuff up as possible, because your research does take a lot of it, but you get huge benefits from it. So you definitely need to be having a good evilness income. Any evilness you find in the dungeon, one of your snots will actually go and grab the crystal and take it to your vault, but any evilness you come across on the overworld will be teleported to your vault as long as you have empty space for it when your creatures walk over it. So there's quite a bit of depth and variety in terms of the different rooms that you can build, and you want rooms to be laid out in a smart way because the shape actually matters. For one, the size matters because of course larger rooms can store more of whatever it is they're built to store. Also, there are some rooms that can have extra machinery built in them, and this usually involves the ability to generate new resources and stuff. So if you have a big enough room, you can actually fit multiple of these resource generating items in there. But you also want to make sure that the walls are covered, and one of the early things you can research just for money in the dungeon tree are doors. And it seems very simple, but you actually do want doors. For one, they help to keep heroes out. If heroes actually start to raid your dungeon and get to one of your doors, then they'll have to actually beat the door down before they can get in there and start destroying all the stuff you've built in it and killing everyone. So the door gives you a little bit of a buffer of extra time to respond to the heroes. But also, every open space that is connected to a room reduces the efficiency by 10%. So, you know, a treasury that doesn't have a door will be at 90% efficiency, so it'll only be able to store 90% of its normal gold, whereas if you add a door to it, it'll jump up to 100% and it'll be used a little bit better. And this goes for every room will have this efficiency rating, and the fewer open walls you have and the more openings that are covered with doors you have, the better the efficiency of whatever that room does will be. You can also, of course, research and build traps of various kinds. These are very important because you will be getting a lot of heroes that start to raid your dungeon and stuff, so you do need a way to actually deter them. And there are several different kinds of traps you can build, including some that overlap with each other. Like, for instance, you could build a saw blade trap along the walls of a corridor, and then build a slowing goop trap underneath that so they're in the saw blades for a longer period of time and take more damage. And traps get extra important in missions where you have more than one entrance into your dungeon, because it's not that difficult to just secure one hallway, but if there's like 3 or 4 entrances that you gotta worry about at once, then yeah, you really do need to actually be trapping them in order to slow heroes down to give you the ability to actually respond. One thing that's kind of interesting is that when you're in your dungeon, you actually have direct control with your big giant evil hand, and you can physically pick things up and plop them around. So if you want all of your monsters to respond to a big incursion of heroes, then you can just press F2, which will automatically pick up all of your available combat units, and then you can just toss them at the enemy in order to have them all fight. But once you're on the overworld, you can't do that anymore. Instead, it switches to more of an RTS control scheme where you actually have to, you know, click the ground and have your army walk there. And this means that you actually have 2 different control schemes depending on whether or not you're on the overworld, which is kind of a neat idea, honestly. It makes sense, of course. It would be very imbalanced if you could just pick your entire army up and plop them right down on the final enemy stronghold whenever you wanted. Like, it'd make things a little bit too easy. You do have to actually walk them around the map. Some monsters can also get some extra sort of activatable abilities if you put enough research into them. And also you have Talia, the sort of hero character, well, hero as in like a hero unit, not heroic. You get what I mean. But she is very powerful and also levels up pretty quick. And is just really nice to have around because she does a lot of range damage, but she also has a couple of spells that she can cast that she'll get as she levels up to increase the power of everyone, including one really useful one that creates a storm, but enhances the move and attack speed of your entire army all at once. It's on a long cooldown, and you can only use it on the overworld, and it costs some of your evilness to actually use, but if you use it at the right time, it can be very powerful. There are a lot of things for you to go up against. They've actually done a really good job of providing a large variety of hazards for you to deal with, because you have the obvious stuff on the overworld, like various packs of roaming heroes and hero encampments to destroy, and there are like turrets and towers of various kinds, like big arbalists and cannons. There's even some more magical stuff later on, some shielding and some construction crews and mana delivery convoys and stuff like that. But the underworld is not entirely yours to exploit at first either, because there are hazards there you've got to deal with. Sometimes while exploring around, you may go into a cave full of spiders and spider nests, and once you unleash them, they'll actually start burrowing towards your base and start taking out your little snots and stuff, so you've got to be careful about those and actually send a detachment of units over to destroy the spider nests so that they stop raiding your base. You'll also sometimes come across entire dwarven strongholds underground. You might just burrow past a wall, and then suddenly there's this entire, like, several room large, huge stronghold filled with angry dwarves right next to you. And that's very bad for you generally, because they will send detachments of units very regularly to raid your halls and actually find your dungeon heart, and you've got to deal with them as soon as you find them. So uncovering a huge dwarven stronghold can be a big problem, and it's something that you need to deal with as quickly as possible. It has its own dungeon heart, and you actually have to send your units through it and destroy the doors. There will be doors that block your path, and you can't put your hand down behind the doors, so you have to destroy all of them in sequence in order to get to the dungeon heart and then blow it up. But it's also a pretty valuable thing to find, even though it adds a bit of extra difficulty, because for one, destroying a dwarven stronghold gives you tons of evilness points that you can spend on research and stuff, and also they almost always have at least one gem vein somewhere around that they were mining, and you can set up your own treasure around it and start your own mining operation there if you want. So there's quite a bit going on here mechanically. It's pretty much exactly what I would want from a game like this. It's got the depth and complexity that I sort of require from a dungeon management game. It's got, I like the 3 faction system and how different the 3 factions are, and the fact that they each kind of give you access to new mechanics, like how the demon skill tree has an entire spell system in it that's just dedicated to it, and it allows you to cast all sorts of different spells, both in the dungeon and in the overworld, to help yourself out as long as you have the mana. It is a bit of a blobby game. There's not a lot of strategy to the combat, although to be fair, the same thing could be said of the original Dungeon Keeper as well. Combat is mostly about making sure you have the right collection of units to be successful, rather than it is about like micromanaging each one of them in very specific ways. You're not microing units in this game, you're making a death ball. That's just how the combat works. One thing that I think might be a bit of a difficult thing for people is the writing. The writing in this game is very silly, but in ways that some people might not appreciate. It's got a lot of like, I know I'm a video game kind of stuff, and also a lot of like meme references and things like that. It's definitely a style. It's a style of writing. It's not necessarily a style that I tend to enjoy all that much, but it's a style, and it is at least helped by the fact that the narrator is very good. So even if the lines he's delivering aren't necessarily the best, the way he delivers them still gives them a certain kind of silliness that I actually appreciate, right? Like, he's got this humor style, this dry humor in his voice that actually comes across very well in lines like this, I think. In fact, that is something that I would say about the game overall, is that whether or not you appreciate the style of writing it has, the voice acting quality is very high. The voice actors do a great job in terms of playing these scenery-chewing, campy, silly, archetypal characters, and whether that's your thing or not is going to depend very much on you, but at least you can say they do a good job of it. You know, their line reads and inflection and stuff like that, it all makes sense in terms of a sort of parody story, and it does at least a good job of being very over-the-top silly pretty much at all times, while also having a quite genuinely satisfying dungeon management and combat layer underneath all of the silliness that makes it just a really good time even if you don't care about the story. The music is also of note, by the way. In fact, the whole audio-visual presentation is really good. Graphically, it's quite a pretty game, and it has this really cool effect on the overworld where good and evil areas clash. You get this sort of blue, colorful wipe of radiant energy for the good areas, and then you get this like dark red and orange, sort of everything charred to cinders zone of evil control, and they sort of tug-of-war fight on the surface as you expand, as both of you expand your armies around and stuff. It's a cool effect, and overall it changes a lot about the aesthetics of the overworld, so it means that it's sort of always in flux, and the underworld, the dungeon itself, looks really good. I mean, there's only so much you can do when it comes to like big slabs of stone to make them look interesting, but at least all of the decoration and the room types and everything, they all have a very distinct look to them. I really like the look of the demon hot tub that you've got to make for them. It's sort of adorable. It's like this evil purple bubbling thing. It's pretty great. So yeah, in terms of its visuals, it's just a very good looking game in general, and it's got a very caricature-esque, exaggerated art style with a good combination of like dark and bright saturated colors that looks really good. And music-wise, it's great. You've got like the sort of prancy, light, kind of fantasy chime music sort of stuff going on in the good areas, like next to the unicorn and things. Then you've got like the more evil sort of downbeat, low rumbling drums and stuff like that of the evil areas. It's a good soundtrack, I think, and it adds to the very sort of cozy atmosphere. It might seem kind of weird to call a game about being evil cozy, but it really is. There's something about Dungeon Keeper, even going back to the originals, that I find very cozy to sort of settle into and have a good time, and I think that Dungeons 4 does a good job of actually capturing that same vibe. Also, by the way, you can play multiplayer, so that's something to consider. I don't have any footage of that really, but it is something that you can do. This game does have multiplayer support, so that's cool. So yeah, overall, this is a game that's really hard for me not to recommend because it's in a genre that we almost don't see any other entries in ever. It's pretty much like an endangered genre, you know, this is like just about all there is. So it's really cool to see them keep it going and actually do it really well. So yeah, if you're a fan of games like Dungeon Keeper or War for the Overworld, or indeed the previous Dungeons games, this is a really good entry. It does a lot to improve the formula with its sort of cool balancing tug-of-war of under and overworld management, while having a good amount of depth and complexity in both layers to keep it interesting. So thank you guys very much for watching. I will put the link in the description below this video to the Steam Store page for Dungeons 4, and I'll see you next time.